When our patrol came across the German sniper, he was already dead, lashed upright to an old oak tree with rawhide straps pulled tight against his body. His rifle had been snapped apart and laid out around him in careful, deliberate patterns, like someone wanted the message to be unmistakable. Carved into the tree above his head were strange markings none of U.S. Americans could make sense of at the time, though those same symbols would strike terror into enemy troops once similar scenes started appearing all over the Ardennes Forest during the next 3 days. What the Wehrmacht never realized was that their most feared sniper, the man they called Edelweiss, who had been haunting Allied lines for nearly 3 months, had stopped being the hunter. He'd become the hunted, caught up in a kind of pursuit that existed long before rifles, armies, or even nations. The figure we would eventually name the Navajo Ghost was showing the German army a hard truth. Some skills never fade away. They just lie dormant until the right moment comes along to remind the modern world what real hunting looks like. The number of dead had been steadily rising for weeks before anyone understood we were facing something more than a highly skilled sniper. Edelweiss wasn't simply killing American soldiers. He was selecting them, dispatching them with a cold, methodical precision that blended expert long-range shooting with a deep understanding of how fear works on the human mind. The officers were always first, their heads bursting apart the instant they lifted binoculars to study enemy lines. After that came the radio men, picked off at the exact second they started sending vital messages. And then the medics, gunned down while helping wounded soldiers in areas that should have been safe, protected by cover and common decency. That kind of terror was exactly what German doctrine aimed to achieve, and it worked. Soldiers who couldn't spot their attacker, couldn't guess when death would arrive, and couldn't defend themselves using normal tactics started cracking under the pressure. Daylight movement slowed to a crawl, officers avoided observation gear, and whole platoons fell into a state of constant suspicion that made teamwork nearly impossible. What truly made Edelweiss so frightening wasn't just how well he could shoot. It was how he seemed to melt into the land itself. The Ardennes in December of '44 was a frozen maze of rolling hills and bare trees, with snow-covered ground and wide open spaces where any movement should have stood out immediately. Still, this ghost fired from spots our scouts couldn't find, used angles that didn't seem physically possible, and vanished before counter-sniper teams could even start figuring out where he'd been. When intelligence finally pieced together a profile, it described an enemy whose grasp of warfare went far beyond anything standard training could explain. Edelweiss didn't just choose targets for military value. He chose them for the fear their deaths would cause, carefully shaping confusion and panic across our lines with every single shot. This guy's sense of timing was dead on. His shooting positions were chosen with absolute precision, and every escape route he used showed an understanding of the land that went far beyond anything printed on our maps. We weren't just dealing with a talented shooter anymore. This was someone who approached killing the way a hunter does, in ways that Western military thinking simply didn't know how to recognize, let alone counter. The turning point came from a place none of us expected. Sergeant Joe Begay, a Navajo code talker assigned to the 28th Infantry Division, went to his commanding officer with an idea that sounded almost absurd, at least to anyone who didn't understand what real, traditional hunting was about. Begay had been studying Edelweiss's attacks for weeks, but he wasn't looking at them like battles or maneuvers. He saw them as hunting patterns, guided by rules that existed long before written history or standing armies. What Begay recognized was a predator who knew his terrain and understood his prey, but who had never gone up against another hunter capable of reading the same signs and thinking with the same instincts. The initial response from the brass made it clear how deep old prejudices ran. Native skills were still treated like folklore or museum pieces, not serious tools for modern combat. Officers raised on radios, artillery tables, and formal tactics couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that methods used to track deer could be applied to fighting a highly trained enemy sniper. The suggestion that ancient knowledge might outperform modern military science went against everything most commanders believed, and few of them were ready to let go of those assumptions. But the casualty list didn't care about anyone's pride. In just 3 weeks, Edelweiss had killed 17 American soldiers, including 2 majors and a battalion intelligence officer whose loss threw operations across the sector into chaos. By then, every standard counter-sniper method had failed. The manuals offered nothing useful against an enemy who seemed to know our movements before we made them, almost as if he had some unnatural awareness of our plans. In the end, permission for Begay's hunting mission only came after all conventional options were burned out, and the psychological strain on our troops started dragging down the fighting strength of the entire division. Even then, the approval was something nobody had seen before. One soldier was about to be turned loose with total freedom to track and eliminate an enemy sniper, using methods that had nothing to do with standard military procedure and everything to do with hunting. These were methods you wouldn't find in any field manual and couldn't control through normal chains of command. There was no checklist for what Begay was about to do, and no officer hovering over his shoulder telling him how to do it. The way he prepared blended traditional Navajo knowledge with adjustments made for the realities of modern war, creating something entirely new to the Army. He didn't just review the spots where Edelweiss had fired from. He studied the weather at those moments, how animals moved through the area, and how seasonal changes affected sound, scent, and the way tracks held or disappeared across different ground. More than anything, Begay focused on thinking the way his quarry thought. He worked to build a picture of the kind of man Edelweiss was, not just as a soldier, but as a hunter who'd earned a fearsome reputation even among his own side. The gear Begay picked would have looked outdated or even foolish to soldiers who believed combat success depended on the most advanced equipment available. Instead of heavy rifles with big scopes, he chose weapons that wouldn't catch the light or give off a flash that could betray his position. He skipped regulation boots altogether, knowing the deep, recognizable tread would leave a clear trail. Instead, he wore soft-soled footwear that let him move quietly and left almost no sign behind. His clothing wasn't chosen to stop bullets or shrapnel. It was meant to disappear into the land itself, blending with the forest in ways no standard-issue camouflage ever could. The tracking abilities Begay carried with him weren't tricks or intuition. They were the result of thousands of years of hard-earned knowledge, passed down by people who survived only because they could see and understand things others never noticed. He could tell one animal from another by its tracks alone, sense changes in the weather by watching plants, and even read a person's emotional state by studying how they moved through space. Modern society liked to brush skills like that off as legend or superstition, but now they were about to be tested against a man who represented the peak of contemporary military training. The earliest clues Begay uncovered at Edelweiss's firing sites revealed details that traditional intelligence work had completely overlooked. This German sniper wasn't just deadly with a rifle. He understood the forest well enough to anticipate how people would react under different conditions. He picked firing positions where natural sound corridors swallowed the crack of his shots, and he traveled along animal trails where human footprints blended into the chaos of the woods instead of standing out. As Begay pieced everything together, the psychological picture that formed was far more layered than Allied analysts had ever imagined, and it was clear they hadn't been dealing with a simple enemy at all. Edelweiss wasn't killing just to gain a tactical edge. What drove him was the satisfaction that came from proving himself superior to the people he hunted. The rhythm of his attacks showed a man who fed off fear, who took real pleasure in knowing whole American units were frozen in place, never sure when or where death would reach out for them next. For Begay, the forest itself became the most reliable source of intelligence he had. He learned to read the story Edelweiss was carving into the land with every move he made through the Ardennes. Snapped twigs pointed out routes of travel. Disturbed snow showed where someone had lain in wait. And even the reactions of animals revealed human activity in places no patrol or report had ever mentioned. As all of this came together, Begay reached a conclusion that was equal parts reassuring and unsettling. Edelweiss really was an exceptional hunter, gifted with abilities no military school could teach. But at the same time, he was bound by patterns that traditional hunting knowledge could recognize, anticipate, and ultimately turn against him. The very thing that made the German sniper so dangerous, his predator's mindset, also made him vulnerable when faced with someone who understood predators better than he ever could. The hunt truly began the moment Begay spotted the first clean footprint Edelweiss had left behind. That single mark in the snow opened a test that would push every lesson Begay had absorbed growing up on the Navajo reservation. The track told a detailed story, the man's rough size and weight, his pace, his state of mind when he passed through, even how confident he felt in that moment. More than anything else, it proved one critical fact. This so-called phantom was flesh and blood, and like any human, he left signs behind for those who knew how to read them. As Begay moved forward, his preparation became as much mental as physical. He had to shed the mindset of a soldier following orders and step fully into the role of a predator stalking prey, knowing only one of them would walk away alive. That shift meant letting go of standard military thinking and embracing instincts tied to ancestors who survived hostile lands by understanding the quiet, invisible bond between hunter and hunted. So what happens when hunting knowledge 10,000 years old collides with the deadliest sniper on the Western Front? Edelweiss got his first answer when he returned to one of his favorite firing positions and found Navajo symbols carved into a nearby tree. To a German marksman trained in European warfare, the markings had no literal meaning, but the effect on his mind was immediate and brutal. Someone had uncovered his most carefully hidden perch, taken time to study his methods, and left behind a message that felt like a challenge, even a taunt. For a man who had ruled the battlefield through fear and psychological dominance, the realization that he was now being hunted triggered a kind of terror he hadn't known in 3 years of war. That shift, from hunter to hunted, didn't happen all at once. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as Begay applied tactics refined across countless generations of Navajo warriors who knew that being discovered often meant death. Instead of chasing Edelweiss head-on, he started shaping the German's environment, nudging events just enough to shake his confidence and push him toward mistakes. Animal trails Edelweiss relied on for silent movement were subtly changed, debris placed in ways that slowed him down just enough to be noticed. Even the natural camouflage around his positions was subtly disturbed, arranged in ways that hinted at observation without ever giving away the watcher's identity. What Begay was doing went far beyond what European military training taught, because it drew on spiritual traditions where hunting was seen as a sacred dance between predator and prey. For the Navajo, tracking wasn't just about following footprints. It was about reading behavior, anticipating reactions, and subtly shaping the environment to guide the quarry where the hunter wanted. Applied to a human target, those same techniques created invisible psychological pressure. Edelweiss didn't notice it at first, but over time it slowly undermined the assumptions he relied on for safety and concealment. December in the Ardennes only helped Begay's cause. Snow, wind, and freezing temperatures became tools rather than obstacles. Fresh snow revealed every footstep, while gusts of wind masked Begay's movements. Storms that would normally drive soldiers to huddle in foxholes became perfect cover for tracking, turning the forest itself into an ally. More importantly, the harsh conditions forced both hunter and prey to make choices about survival that revealed their personalities and tactics. The first direct confrontation came quietly. Edelweiss reached one of his chosen firing points, only to find his rifle nudged exactly 6 inches to the left, aimed not at American lines, but at empty forest. That tiny adjustment was a message that couldn't be misread. Someone had been observing him closely enough to know his routine, had approached without being detected, and had the skill to manipulate his weapon without leaving obvious evidence. From that point on, Begay began escalating the pressure, demonstrating how psychological mastery could outmatch brute confrontation. Footprints appeared overnight near German positions. Snow showed signs of someone lying in wait during Edelweiss's absence. And most unnerving of all, small offerings of food and water, left carefully to be discovered, made it clear that every movement he made was anticipated and watched. Edelweiss tried to fight back with conventional counter-tracking methods, but it only revealed his growing desperation. The tactics he had mastered for years were useless against someone moving according to entirely different rules. German training focused on camouflage and misdirection, but those skills were meaningless against a tracker who could read disturbances invisible to anyone without traditional hunting knowledge. Slowly, the constant observation and manipulation wore him down, eating away at his confidence and focus. It showed in the small ways at first: hesitation before taking a shot, repeated glances over his shoulder, but soon it became obvious. His legendary accuracy began to slip, and the paranoia creeping into his mind disrupted the precision and timing that had made him a terror on the battlefield. Edelweiss's choice of positions started to show a pattern, driven less by tactical sense and more by fear. He gravitated toward spots that felt safe psychologically, even if they were poor choices strategically. His legendary patience, what had made him so deadly, began to vanish under the pressure, and stress forced him to take risks that exposed him to observation and potential attack. That's when Begay moved into the final phase of the hunt. He knew the psychological pressure had done its work. Edelweiss was shaken, unsure, and vulnerable. Now it was time for direct confrontation to prevent the sniper from regaining confidence or slipping off to new hunting grounds. Begay's approach drew from Navajo techniques developed for dealing with dangerous predators, not just wolves and bears, but human enemies whose skills could threaten entire communities. The trap he set combined the natural features of the forest with carefully applied psychological manipulation, forcing Edelweiss into a situation where every choice revealed his position while shrinking his options for escape or counterattack. Using weeks of tracking, Begay predicted exactly where the German would move when pushed to the breaking point, and he prepared that location as the site of their final encounter. The morning of the hunt brought perfect conditions. Heavy snow muffled sound and limited visibility, while wind patterns carried scents in ways that would give Begay information about Edelweiss's location and emotional state. Traditional hunters knew that successful tracking required more than following footprints. It demanded reading fear, confidence, desperation, and decision-making in the subtle cues prey left behind. When the confrontation came, it lasted less than 10 minutes. But those minutes represented the culmination of a hunting tradition stretching back generations, connecting Begay to ancestors who had survived in lands where failure meant death, not just for the hunter, but for entire families and communities. Skills that commanders had dismissed as primitive folklore had proven superior to European training, which emphasized technology and conventional tactics over environmental awareness and psychological insight. The next day, German patrols discovered Edelweiss's body. He was bound with traditional materials and marked with symbols that suggested both physical and spiritual defeat. The message was clear. The Germans were facing enemies whose abilities could not be measured or countered by conventional military thinking. Begay's success went beyond eliminating a single sniper. It offered intelligence and strategic insight into unconventional warfare, influencing American military approaches for decades. The operation revealed psychological dimensions of combat that standard training had never addressed, showing that traditional indigenous skills could be adapted for modern warfare with devastating effectiveness. The psychological impact on German forces became apparent in the weeks following Edelweiss's death, as enemy sniper activity throughout the Ardennes sector declined dramatically due to fear of facing similar hunters who might be operating in other areas. The legend of the Navajo Ghost spread through Wehrmacht units, creating paranoia that affected operational effectiveness and morale in ways that conventional military pressure couldn't achieve. The recognition that Begay received for his achievement was necessarily limited by military policies that restricted acknowledgement of Native American contributions to the war effort. But intelligence officers understood that he had demonstrated capabilities that deserved study and potential replication. The success of traditional hunting techniques against modern military opponents suggested applications that could influence special operations doctrine and unconventional warfare training. The broader implications of Begay's hunt extended beyond military applications to challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between traditional knowledge and modern technology. The operation proved that skills developed over thousands of years by indigenous peoples retained practical value in contemporary situations, particularly when those situations involved human psychology and environmental awareness rather than purely technological challenges. The personal cost of the hunt became apparent to Begay only after the immediate tactical objectives had been achieved, and he had time to reflect on the spiritual dimensions of what he had accomplished. Traditional Navajo hunting involved ceremonial elements that honored the relationship between hunter and prey, acknowledging that taking life required accepting responsibility for the spiritual consequences of ending another being's existence. The legacy of the Navajo Ghost operation influenced American military policy regarding the utilization of indigenous knowledge and skills in warfare, establishing precedents that would guide special operations recruitment and training programs from World War II through modern conflicts. The success demonstrated that diversity of background and experience could provide tactical advantages that conventional military thinking had never imagined. The historical significance of Begay's achievement remained largely classified for decades after the war, hidden by security policies that protected not just operational details, but cultural knowledge that military planners considered too sensitive for public discussion. When records were finally released, historians discovered that traditional hunting techniques had played crucial roles in Allied victory that conventional military accounts had never acknowledged. Sergeant Joe Begay returned to the Navajo Reservation in 1946, but his experience in the Ardennes Forest had demonstrated that ancient wisdom retained relevance in modern warfare, proving that some skills never become obsolete. They just wait for the right moment to remind civilization that survival sometimes depends on knowledge that transcends technology and connects human beings to instincts that industrial society has forgotten but never truly abandoned. The Navajo Ghost had proven that in the eternal game of hunter and hunted, victory belongs not to the most advanced weapons or the latest tactics, but to the warrior who understands that true hunting is a spiritual discipline that connects mind, body, and environment in ways that no amount of technological sophistication can replace or defeat.